Anyone who has ever wandered the English countryside or sailed its many rivers and canals will at some point have seen these strange concrete ruins. My name is Mirit Gosney, and growing up in West Berkshire I was always fascinated by these structures. Better known as pillboxes, these fortifications played a key role in Britain's anti-invasion defence strategy during the early years of the Second World War. Today, pillbox spotting is a popular pastime for Second World War enthusiasts. However, this practice does little to better our understanding of Britain's defensive framework. What was the function of pillboxes? Why does so much misinformation surround them? Just how effective were they in supporting the British war effort?
So yeah, I'd say that's probably the biggest challenge is that we're going to see continued loss of these surviving defences, and there's nothing much we can really do about it other than make sure they're properly recorded.
It is May 1940. Nazi forces continue their rapid expansion across Western Europe, trapping hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers all along the coast of France. Here, British and French troops desperately await to be evacuated. Meanwhile, the enemy continues to draw closer. Thanks to Christopher Nolan's 2017 blockbuster Dunkirk, we now understand that the Allies managed to avert a major military disaster here. A series of daring operations launched between May and June 1940 succeeded in evacuating 500,000 Allied troops. Still, Britain's hardship was far from over. 2 months later, Hitler announces his plans for a full-scale amphibious invasion of England, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. This is set to launch in August 1940. As Churchill's war cabinet scrambles to get organised and restore its tattered military, the monumental task of securing Britain's defences falls to General Sir Edmund Ironside. Ironside was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Home Forces in May 1940. Concerns that an invasion would penetrate the English coastline turned Ironside's attention further inland. Under no circumstances could the Nazis be allowed to rampage through Britain as they had done in Belgium and France. The prospect of Britain losing the war was now more real than ever. General Ironside immediately began mapping out plans for a complex network of nationwide defensive stoplines. His proposed GHQ main stop line ran from Somerset to the Thames estuary. This then continued on towards Yorkshire, before eventually terminating in Scotland, comprising over 800 miles in total. A number of smaller secondary stop lines also reinforced the GHQ line. A large portion of the GHQ line ran through West Berkshire. Located in the southeast of England, this county was the site of the Blue Stop Line, more famously known as the Ironside Line. This followed the course of the Kennet-on-Avon Canal, which still flows 87 miles between Bristol and Reading. Most of the 150 pillboxes which survived the war in Berkshire are still dotted along this stretch of water. As soon as this strategy received the thumbs up from the War Cabinet, the Royal Engineers Field Company began surveying the nation for points of strategic vulnerability. Then, civilian contractors employed under the Directorate of Fortifications and Works began building tens of thousands of defences all across 1940 to 1941. Pillboxes formed a large part of this defensive infrastructure. Their mission? To safeguard bridges, road junctions, railway lines, waterways, and indeed anywhere else where an enemy might attempt to cross further into the country. Pillbox construction followed 6 standard designs. Among these was the Type 22 infantry pillbox. A surviving example of one of these still stands next to Thatcham railway station. Note the metal pipe protruding from the roof to allow for better ventilation inside. Another example lies less than a mile west of here at Monkey Marsh Lock. Not only is this fun to say, but the accessibility of this pillbox allows for easier study. This features reinforced bulletproof concrete walls with an anti-ricochet wall built within to protect its inhabitants from shrapnel damage. Although this would have done little in reality had an explosive detonated inside. Some pillboxes also had a blast wall located outside the main entrance for the same effect. Pillboxes always had firing loopholes like these to enable rifle and light machine gun fire from within. Another popular design was the Type 28 artillery pillbox. A unique example of a twin Type 28 anti-tank gun placement is located at Dunmill Lock in Hungerford. Impressive and physically imposing, this unstoppable duo are elevated high above ground level, guarding both the canal and railway bridge. Unlike the Type 22, this static fortress has thicker, shell-proof walls capable of withstanding heavy bombardment. Additional features include wide-stepped embrasures and interior dividing walls, indicating its capacity to house light machine guns such as the LMG or Bren gun. It could also fit a 2-pounder anti-tank gun. Building materials and construction techniques varied at a local level. The availability of resources, different terrain, and the strategic needs of every landscape of the country all influenced how pillboxes were built and appear today. Here, it is clear that the builders used steel girders to reinforce the concrete walls and ceiling, along with internal breeze block shuttering and external brick shuttering. This would also give the impression to the enemy that the structure was built entirely of brick. Timber was sometimes used for the same effect, but this was in short supply. Stationary stop lines must have seemed outdated in a new age of combined arms warfare, something which the Nazis had embraced to full effect all across mainland Europe. For comparison, how did Britain's defences compare to Hitler's Atlantic Wall? This formidable and superior line of coastal defences stretched 2,800 miles from Norway to the French-Spanish border. It consisted of bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, artillery batteries and radar stations. It overshadowed Britain's defences both in scale and ambition. Yet, despite all of its grandeur, what took the Nazis 2 years to build, the Allies managed to breach in a single day. So when discussing pillboxes, it is important to remember that they only formed one part of Britain's defensive strategy. To better understand this, I reached out to Chris Kolonko, a leading authority on Second World War concrete.
Today, when you generally look at a pillbox, you're looking at it in isolation. You're looking at this one structure in a wider landscape. So what a lot of people do is look at the structure rather than looking outwards. And what we need to really consider now is that, a single pillbox is one defensive structure of a much wider defensive landscape. What we see today, with the individual pillbox or a group of pillboxes, represents a fraction of what was originally constructed during the Second World War. So a lot of the stuff that originally existed, such as slit trenches, barbed wire, anti-tank obstacles, and obviously the soldiers themselves no longer exist. And this gives us a kind of skewed picture of how effective these defences were, because you're not seeing the full range.
But sadly, these defences have not left their mark on the landscape in the same way that pillboxes have, which is why they are often absent from discussions on this subject. Pillboxes were only ever meant to delay an enemy offensive long enough until the regular army, territorial forces and army reserves could mobilise and coordinate a counterattack. Also, underground resistance cells known as the GHQ auxiliaries were set up in June 1940 to counter an occupying force. Guerrilla units would conduct night raids and lead sabotage operations to hinder the enemy's control over the country.
Today, like you say, the Home Guard get all the attention, and the auxiliaries get a fair bit. But the regular and territorial army are rarely mentioned, even though they were the primary fighting force. And the big problem is looking at these things again in isolation. So you're looking at a wider organisation, but then you're just focusing on like the Home Guard, the LDV, and the auxiliary units when they were part of a cohesive network. And it's kind of like looking at D-Day and Operation Overlord by just looking at the military police.
The distribution of Thatcham's defences is quite telling. The south-facing direction of their embrasures reveals that these pillboxes anticipated an assault from this direction. They would also have provided mutual fire support to one another to prevent attackers from crossing the railway bridge and marching on towards the Midlands. This is consistent with their entrances being built on the north side, allowing for a speedy exit in the event of being overrun. The embrasures on the Type 28 pillboxes in Hungerford primarily point south and west, again providing an insight into the thought process of local army command. North of the canal, there is another pillbox waiting in reserve. This one is a Type 22. I couldn't help but thinking that this pillbox felt somewhat exposed. Evidently, I wasn't alone. Less than a mile east of this spot is Wire Lock. The railway bridge here shows evidence of anti-tank vertical rail sockets, and just above this, beside a sluice gate on the River Kennet, lie the remains of anti-tank blocks. These obstacles would have stopped tanks and armoured vehicles from crossing these waterways. To some degree, they would have also prevented the enemy from flanking this Type 22 from the east. What is surprising to learn is just how short-lived the stopline strategy was. This lasted only 2 months. The reason for this is twofold. Once General Sir Alan Brooke replaced General Ironside as Commander-in-Chief of the Home Forces in July 1940, Britain's defensive strategy gradually evolved from stoplines to more concentrated areas of resistance, such as nodal points and anti-tank islands. Northern Command also held a different outlook towards how it implemented its defensive strategy compared to other regions of the country. This had already made the transition to nodal points before General Brooke even assumed his command. This explains why the GHQ line abruptly ends in Lincolnshire and why Ironside's grand vision was never realised.
So he pretty much completely did away with the GHQ line and, where possible, incorporated those defences into nodal points. So every town and village and place where the road and rail network converged, or river crossings, airfields, whole range of things were defended with a series of defences to deny them to the enemy. Essentially what happens is the further you go inland, the more bogged down you get to a point where you can't push inland any further because you're either out of resources or you've got troops tied up in the rear, busy trying to sort out these nodal points and other things, and then at which point the GHQ reserve can come in and kind of like offer the final blow and stop the invasion moving inland.
Britain eventually stood down its defences in mid-1943. By this time, the Home Guard had played an active role in patrolling Britain's home defences as the regular army had been deployed to France. The tide of the war was now turning in favour of the Allies, meaning Britain's invasion hysteria was finally allowed to ease. In reality, its defences had already become obsolete long before this point. The decisive outcome of the Battle of Britain in 1940 and the emergence of conflict on the Eastern Front in 1941 forced Hitler to postpone his conquest of Britain indefinitely. Britain's defences were never tested in combat, so measuring their effectiveness in repelling an invasion is difficult. Today they have been demolished or eroded away, but many are still standing, silent decaying monuments to an invasion that thankfully never came. For better or worse, during Britain's darkest hour, they were all that stood between us and total Nazi domination.